Pope Francis' final wish before dying. No one saw this coming for years. Pope Francis was known for his humility, his closeness to the people, and his reformist spirit within the Vatican. But very few knew that, in silence, he carried a deeply personal wish, one not rooted in power, politics, or doctrine, but in something far more human. In this video, we reveal what Pope Francis' final wish was before his death, and why it moved the entire world. Stay until the end, subscribe to this channel, and comment, what would you have done in his place? The silence of Papal Salad. Despite his ever-present smile and humble presence, Francis lived a salad few could imagine. In the quiet corridors of the Vatican, surrounded by centuries-old walls and under the constant gaze of the world, the Pope took refuge in memory. He often talked of his youth in Buenos Aires, of the dusty streets where served the poor, of the faces that inspired his vocation. Far from the noise of ecclesial politics, Francis wrote in his personal journals, reflecting on his mission and the unresolved matters of his soul. As his health began to falter, medical visits became more frequent, and rumors about his condition quietly circulated among the cardinals. One especially cold night, seated before the image of sleeping Saint Joseph, his favorite saint, Francis felt that the end was near. It was then that he made a decision, to write a letter. Not an encyclical or official statement, but an intimate, handwritten message, his most human legacy. The letter began without titles, without formal greetings. It simply read, "If you're reading this, I'm no longer with you. But my soul still is." In it, Francis spoke in a tone unlike any used in his homilies. It was the voice of a man embracing his humanity, acknowledging his faults, and bidding a sincere farewell. He shared episodes from his life that had never been made public, how painful it was to leave his family to enter seminary, the day he felt utterly alone as archbishop, surrounded by powerful people speaking in a language of ambition he couldn't understand. The letter wasn't only for believers, it was for the marginalized, the distant, the hopeless. His wish was that his words would reach the ones who suffer most, showing them that even a pope can feel fear, doubt, and need love. In that same document, he revealed his final wish, that his body not be buried in the Vatican or any famous basilica. He wanted to be laid to rest among the poor, in an Argentine sanctum, among the very people who had inspired his pastoral mission. He didn't want marble or gold, used dirt and simple flowers. More than that, he asked for the creation of a foundation in his name, not to build temples, but to feed, heal, and educate the poor. The request shocked those closest to him but was received with deep reverence. It was undoubtedly Francis' final lesson, to die as he lived, with his feet on the ground and his heart with the suffering. The Vatican's inner response to the contents of the Pope's letter were not made public immediately. Only a tight circle had read the document, and many were stand by the Pope's final request. Some cardinals, steeped in protocol and tradition, felt unsettled. How would they explain to the Catholic world that the Pope wished to be buried far from Rome? What would this mean for the Church's prestige? But others, particularly younger, Reform-minded leaders, understood instantly the depth and symbolism of the decision. To them, it wasn't a rapture, but the perfect culmination of everything Francis had preached, a church of the poor, for the poor, a living faith without embellishment. Private discussions in Vatican halls intensified. Would they honor his wish? Would they dare break centuries of tradition? It was Cardinal Rodriguez, one of Francis' oldest allies, who stepped up. He convened the College of Cardinals in a private chamber and read aloud the key passage of the letter. When he finished, silence fell. No one moved. Emotion filled the air. Several cardinals, visibly moved, nodded solemnly. They could not deny the Pope his final wish. Quiet preparations began. Behind the scenes, community leaders in an Argentine sanctum were contacted. The wall, to ensure the burial site was protected, yet open to the people. The process was not easy. Opposition emerged from factions who believed such a move could diminish papal dignity. But Francis' spirit lived on in his words, and the letter became a spiritual guide for every decision that followed. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate online. Some speculated the Pope had left behind secret instructions, others suggested a mere resign again. But no one imagined the magnitude of what was unfolding. The letter remained tightly guarded. The Vatican was preparing an official announcement, but the time had not yet come. Tension lingered in the air. The world worried about the Pope's health, and aware that within the sacred walls, one of the most moving and revolutionary decisions in modern church history was taking shape. The silent farewell. The final days of Francis' life were marked by a strange calm, almost prophetic. Those who visited him noticed a serenity in his face that contradicted his physical deterioration. So few visitors, but each received heartfelt words they would never forget. To a young Argentine monk, he said, "Faith is not imposed, it is planted like a seed and watered with tears." To an African nun combating human trafficking, he took her hand and whispered, "You are the true face of this church." He didn't speak about himself. He made no requests. He simply listened, and blessed. Doctors maintained his care but knew his will was not to prolong unnecessary suffering. He wanted no machines, no cameras, no press releases. Only peace. The night before his death, he asked to be alone for a few minutes. He lit a small candle, placed the crucifix he had brought from Argentina beside him, and sat in silence. According to the priest who later found him, he had fallen asleep in his chair with a look of deep peace. At dawn, when his death was confirmed, the Vatican released a brief statement. Pope Francis has returned to the Father's house. The world was shaken. Crowds gathered in plazas, churches, and streets to pray and honor him. But the Vatican remained silent on burial details. Cameras focused on St. Peter's Square, expecting a grand procession, aware that history was about to take a very different turn. When the letter's contents were finally revealed, the reaction was overwhelming. Some cried, others knelt. The Pope's words were so raw, so truthful, they transcended borders and religions. His final wish was not to be remembered in stone, but in action. He asked that no money be spent on monuments, but rather on food, education, and the health. He wanted schools, not cathedrals, built in his name. His vision was clear, a church living in the streets, listening, embracing. It was a final call many saw as a spiritual revolution. Even skeptics understood, Francis had not just been a pope. He was a prophet of our time. The return to the Sanctorum. The logistics of transporting the Pope's body to a Sanctorum were complex and controversial, not just for security or diplomatic reasons, but because it defied everything traditionally considered papal protocol. Yet the Vatican chose to follow his will to the letter. Quiet meetings were held with Argentine authorities, grassroots leaders, and social organizations that had been closest to Francis during his life. The chosen location was a small parish in Villa Itatí, one of the most impoverished neighborhoods outside de Buenos Aires. It was there, among dirt roads and graffiti-covered walls, that Francis had often celebrated Mass back when he was still Jorge Bergoglio. Among birthed children and single mothers, he had come to understand that the true greatness of the church resided in its people. When the coffin arrived, covered only with a white cloth and a wooden cross, silence fell. There were no grand bells or hymns, only the quiet sobs of those witnessing his final journey. Elderly women who had known him as a priest, children rushed hearing his name, and young workers all stood united in an unorganized but overflowing sea of love. He was buried in a small corner of the grounds beneath a jacaranda tree. The gravestone, used as he had requested, bore only the words, "Francis, servant of the poor." No title. No date. Used his name and his mission. And so, through whispered prayers and eyes lifted to the sky, the Pope's final wish was fulfilled. Images of the burial went viral. International media struggled to interpret the symbolism of a papal at tourist without marble or gold. Some called it the humblest papal burial in history, others compared it to legendary spiritual figures. But for those present, there was no comparison. It was the fulfillment of a promise. Francis had declared he wanted a church that goes out, and he went first. He walked away from Vatican halls, away from grandeur, away from a history written by the powerful. He chose to be remembered not in statues, but in acts. And that, more than any encyclical, became his living testament. The living legacy of Francis following his death, initiatives inspired by his final words sprang up across the world. In forgotten neighborhoods throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa, entire communities began organizing soup kitchens, health centers, schools, and shelters bearing his name. These weren't created by major NGOs or global donors, but by neighbors, grassroots priests, volunteers, and dreamers turning grief into action. One of the most impactful projects was a network of Francis houses offering free medical care, emotional support, and community education. Funded by small donations and community effort, these centers became beacons of hope. His face appeared in murals not as a figure of power, but as a symbol of tenderness and justice. The Francis Foundation, established by his request in the letter, quickly connected hundreds of grassroots social projects within a year. With no lavish headquarters or bloated salaries, it functioned as a collaborative network. Its volunteers repeated one of his final homily lines: "If you don't disturb the world, maybe you're not following Jesus." It was a provocative call, but a necessary one. His image became less mythic and more human. For many, he was no longer a distant figure of Rome, but someone they could see in themselves. Every story posted on social media, every testimony from the slums or shelters, spoke of personal transformation inspired by him. And that message kept growing, far beyond the boundaries of Catholicism. In universities, interfaith forums, and activist spaces, his final words were studied as non-official yet deeply spiritual doctrine. Even groups that had once opposed him, feminist circles, LGBTQI communities, began reconsidering their stance. Not because he had resolved every tension, but because he had shown openness and a willingness to listen rare among global leaders. His death did not mark the end of an era, it opened a new one. And his final wish became a shared mission. A flame that no longer needed altars to keep burning. The world response religious leaders from across the globe expressed awe and respect for Francis' final will. From the Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople to Muslim imams in the Middle East, rabbis in Jerusalem, and Buddhist monks in Tibet, everyone acknowledged him as a symbol of peace and dialogue. The United Nations released a tribute titled Francis, the Pope of Humanity. Public schools in several countries shared his story as an example of humility. Even governments previously critical of the Vatican praised his moral integrity. Francis, that united people who would never otherwise sit at the same table. And they did it without pomp or speeches, used through the force of a life lived for others. Social media exploded with messages under the hashtag #Gracias Francisco. People from every continent shared how his words had touched their lives. A young man in Mexico credited a spiritual retreat inspired by Francis for overcoming addiction. A woman in war-torn Syria said his letters brought her hope in the darkness. The testimonials were real, powerful, and human. Amid the digital noise, his name trended, not because of scandal or politics, but because of love. Videos resurfaced of him visiting prisons, hospitals, and refugee camps. People rediscovered a man who never sought applause, only embrace. And in rediscovering him, many decided to change. Even in death, Francis became a catalyst for transformation. His voice lived on in podcasts, documentaries, books, and films, but more so in small daily acts, a mother forgiving, a Jew serving, a politician listening. He hadn't been canonized yet, but for millions, he was already a saint. Not because of supernatural miracles, but because of something even greater, restoring fighting humanity. The Church allowed being the Vatican, in the aftermath of his passing, fast a moment of deep self-examination. The internal divisions Francis had worked so hard to bridge began resurfacing. Some conservative factions wanted to reinstate traditional practices, others sought to deepen his reforms. But no one could ignore the massive impact of his legacy. A new generation of priests and religious leaders now viewed the papacy not as a seat of power, but as a radical act of service. His style had planted a new spirituality, pastoral, committed, and simple. The conclave to elect his successor was one of the most intense in modern history. Fierce speeches, bold proposals, and emotional debates filled the days. But in the end, a humble African cardinal who had spent decades working with victims of war and poverty was chosen. His first act was to visit Francis, Grave, not to ask for blessings, but to say thank you. Thank you for opening the door he must now walk through, he said, through tears. And in that moment, many realized the Church had entered a new era, not built on walls, but on bridges. Subsequent decisions confirmed that direction, increased participation of women in leadership, transparent audits of Vatican finances, bold interreligious initiatives, and structural reforms within the clergy. Not everything was perfect, and not everything was fast, but a new course was set. Francis had not just been a beloved pope, he had been a turning point. And though his tomb wasn't at St. Peter's, his spirit lived in every corner of that basilica, and far beyond. Because the Church allowed being no longer resided in palaces, but in awakened the arts. The echo of a true life as years passed, Francis' image became a legend. In schools, neighborhoods, and homes, his story was told like a modern parable. Not as a flawless myth, but as a life full of light and shadow, triumph and contradiction, and yet, stunning coherence. Documentaries chronicled his childhood in Argentina, his rise during the dictatorship, and his unexpected papal election. But what stood out was not his career, it was his ability to listen, to ask forgiveness, to look others in the eye. He was a pope who didn't speak from a throne, but from the bench beside you. That closeness became eternal. His final letter was studied in universities as literature, theology, and ethics. It inspired novels, plays, political manifestos, and songs. But above all, it inspired action. Every time someone defended the voiceless, comforted the sick, or embraced the enemy, people would say, that's what Francis would be done. Not as a slogan, but as real guidance. His grave in Villa Itatí became a pilgrimage site. There were no relics or golden cases, just soil, flowers, and a wooden bench for reflection. Thousands visited not to ask for miracles, but to seek meaning. And maybe that was his true miracle, showing that holiness is not found in the unreachable, but in the profoundly human. That a pope could die as he lived, surrounded by the least, with an open heart, and a wish that no one expected, but everyone needed. Because Francis' final wish wasn't for himself, it was for the world. And that wish now lives in us.